Okay, so this is my reflective process journal, and this is number 2, this entry. I'll be focusing on behaviour management for a bottom set Year 10 class. The teacher, she checks homework outside the class whilst the class lined up, and any students that haven't done their homework, the first thing she does is she makes them stand for the first 10 minutes of the class. So they're there in the middle of the in the class, pretty much humiliated. But that's just the system she has for incomplete homework. Generally at the school, the system is for detention, but she has different methods. For me, I think this is a bit harsh. I think it's kind of interesting because she really wants to establish the fact that she's the teacher, she's the boss. She has this very old school view of the relationship between the teacher and students, and I found that quite interesting. So that happened at the start of this lesson as well. There were 2 girls who were standing. After 10 minutes, they're told to sit down, but quite sternly, and she's still quite angry at them, visibly. So that's kind of really drilled home to them. And that's quite significant was there was one girl who was an EAL student, so English is another language, and she was really struggling to understand what was happening on the board and what the teacher was saying. At one point, a girl next to her who spoke Arabic explained to her in Arabic one of the concepts, and she happened to do this whilst the teacher was speaking, and the teacher got very upset and pointed her out for this. So this to me was kind of it was unfair in that the girl was talking about the work, but I can understand she spoke over the teacher, and as a result, the teacher wanted to make a point of this. But then for the rest of the lesson, she didn't say anything to this girl, and this girl clearly struggled as a result. So this kind of brings you back to this idea of a system in place in which we are teaching in English. It's important that students learn in English, but I would believe that in early stages, rather than criticizing the student or disciplining the student for speaking at the same time, I would say, excuse me, can you save the explanation for once I've finished talking, and kind of mediate the situation, as opposed to just immediately make it seem like it's a negative action that requires sanctioning. Another point of note is that all students are basically paying attention, and there's almost no talking throughout the entire lesson. So behaviour management is not an issue, but I can't help but notice this is something I think is really worth noting, because they just there seems to be very little enthusiasm and very little kind of inspiration injected into these students. It almost seems like a chore for both the teacher and for the students. What I will say though is that the class finishes with the teacher handing out house points, so there's a positive ending, and this is responded to really well by the students. They love it. It makes me think, the teacher is capable of having this kind of positive attitude and a happy classroom environment, but at the same time, what if she did this more often, not just at the end? What if she enabled this to happen throughout the entire lesson? So this moves me on to my discussion with the teacher. Her attitude was essentially, I think, summed up well in this quote, which was, if they did their work, there'd be no need to be so harsh. If you're going to have a classroom in which behaviour management is the focus, is the priority, and the students listen and the teacher tells, I can't see how there's going to be much enthusiasm for the work, how it's not going to seem monotonous, laborious. Another thing I must say as well is that she plans her lessons with pretty much a presentation on the board and little to no textbook work. So it's another form of behaviour management, because there's no kind of room for the students to get distracted. They have to be focusing on what's on the board. I think that's a really useful technique. So when speaking with the pupils, I spoke with 2 students after the class, and so I haven't put the students' names. So one indicates when obviously the first student was speaking, and 2 the other. And I spoke to them together. They were friends, and often they kind of they echoed the same sentiments. So what I will say is that they were naturally respectful, but clearly fearful of the teacher. I could see this without them even saying it, but they were talking about her, obviously as the teacher, and they were saying that they have to follow what she said, and that was very clear for them. But I could hear in the tone of their voice that they were kind of a bit, they felt like they had to say this. Another thing, without blowing my blowing my own trumpet, is that before she arrived and I was standing out the front of the lesson, the students were lining up. One of them looked at me with a smile and went, "Oh, are you going to take Gus today?" And I said, "Oh, no, I'm not. I'm just observing." And she was quite visibly let down by that. And I couldn't help but think, oh, well, poor girl, she's, it's not like she's going, "Oh, maths, this is something I detest." She's quite affected by, the choice of teacher, which I think is, a very natural thing. One of them was very critical of the subject and how boring it is, she said. Now, I wondered, is this the content or is this the teaching method, Because as I said before, I find that the teaching method is quite monotonous, and I wonder if it was taught in a kind of more creative way or potentially more relaxed way, that actually, she wouldn't see maths as boring. She would hopefully open her mind a bit more. The recall method of teaching obviously allowed them to be very knowledgeable of the terminology used. So their process of answering, for example, class frequency tables was sound. They could do it. But as soon as it came to something that was a little bit more abstract or alternative approach, they really struggled. And I'd seen this over the past couple of lessons. So I wonder if, the teacher should go for a more divergent kind of approach. One of the girls who was an EAL student, but not the same one who had the punishment before, she was saying she really appreciates the teacher's clarity when talking, and I can understand where with other teachers it's not quite clear enough because she doesn't really pick up on what they're saying because they speak quite quickly. So I thought that was quite good. And that obviously comes back to the fact that she has the lesson on the board, and as a result it's kind of clear and direct for all the students to learn. They said, when I asked them, what they think could be better in the class or what they would prefer, they said they'd feel like they'd be more willing and excited to learn if group discussion was encouraged more often. And I totally agree with this. I think that if they were talking about the work, this wouldn't be an issue, and it would kind of allow them to put their ideas of the concepts in their own words and kind of express from there. So this brings me to my references. So I'm going to go over this quite quickly because I have a 15-minute time limit on my my YouTube video, but these are some quotes and references that I thought were really useful and kind of linked directly to the observation that I'd seen. The first is by a guy called Henry Pluckrose. He wrote a book called School, A Place for Children, ? And he talks about the teacher needing to be continually evaluating what is happening to the children in his/her care. And I really like this word care because this is what I feel like when I'm witnessing this teacher, is that she kind of has a motherly-like quality. She's very strict, but at the same time I can see she really cares for the students and she wants to protect them. So maybe what she kind of needs to think a little bit more about is potentially a pragmatic approach as opposed to an emotional approach, and what she thinks is the kind of the most effective way from her perspective. Maybe she should get some student feedback on how that is. He talks about early days at school. You can read here, I've written it down, and how effectively if you make school unhappy for someone, then it can affect them in so many other ways, throughout their career in later life. So they can have anxiety and stress that's just kind of embedded in there. And at the same time, if you make these days happy, when it comes to institutionalization, they tend to deal with this far more, and it's bearable and stress free. which I think is really important. And this class seems to be headed down the first road from my perspective. Sugru also talks about, who's wrote a book called The Future of Educational Change, how group work in high school, she's talking about high schools in America, although they appear far less in secondary schools as opposed to primary schools, there is a lot of variations of grouping that occurs for academic subjects like mathematics. And she also just kind of supports the claim that between the 1890s and 1980s, social organisation of the classroom has become increasingly informal. So, it's been a natural progression that group discussion is encouraged. The environment of a classroom is more relaxed than it used to be, but that doesn't seem to be the case in the lesson I observed. So going to Dix, who wrote an article for The Guardian, and it's called How to Manage Behaviour in the Classroom. I really like this idea of closed requests. So rather than shouting at a student, give them a closed request. For example, thank you for putting your bag on the hook. And the thing is the trust in the student that this statement implies, combined with the clarity of the expectation, often results in immediate action. So I wonder if this might be an approach she could potentially take, this teacher, where it doesn't seem so, you against me, but rather giving them a simple request. It's clear, which I know she could deliver very easily, and then moving straight onto something positive, so that it doesn't seem like it's even been a form of discipline. The last thing I just wanted to note about it was the DFE talks about basically these conditions that you have to satisfy in terms of punishment and discipline. And one of them is it must not breach any other legislation, for example, in respect of disability, special educational needs, race, and all other equalities and human rights, and it must be reasonable in all the circumstances. Now, I'm not accusing this teacher of necessarily breaking this condition, but it just made me think, if you have someone who's come from another country, they still can't quite speak the language, maybe you need to consider that the circumstances are quite a bit different, and, encouraging this idea of, okay, don't speak over me when I'm talking, but I respect the fact that, someone is trying to explain this to you in your native language, and, for maybe the first few lessons, I can allow this to happen, just so that you can pick up what's happening, and then we have to focus on doing it just in English. I think something like this might be much better. So to conclude, here's my reference list, and I guess I want to say that I think behaviour management is without a doubt an incredibly important part of teaching, to the point where it's its own teaching standard, number 7, I believe. And this class has been of particular interest to me, and it's shown me the positives and negatives of behaviour management. I think the theory shows that a positive and relaxed environment really is the best environment for a classroom. However, you have to be very subjective. You have to understand if the students just can't behave themselves in that kind of environment, then you have to have sanctions in place. And this is essentially what this teacher has said, and this is how she defends her approach to teaching this classroom. Really going back to the kind of philosophy of education, we're teaching students to understand something, but we're also teaching them to think outside the box and to effectively have this idea of self-defense when it comes to intellectual and academic subjects. So they know how to approach a situation or a problem based off what we've taught them, as opposed to them just rote learning something and repeating a process like a robot. So this is my view. I can't say that this is the truth, but I believe this is, from what I've read, from the references I've given, and from what I've observed and who I've spoken to, this is essentially the most important thing. If you make a subject a unpleasant experience and something that has to be done as opposed to something that wants to be done, then really I think you're fighting an uphill battle.